Okay, we're now recording, and our NPEP director, Jennifer Leckie, will introduce the session.
Hi, so I'm delighted to welcome you all to the third event in the Toward Transformative Justice Community Roundtable series on race, racism, and policing, hosted by the Northwestern Prison Education Program. So as Arturo said, I'm the director of the Northwestern Prison Education Program, and we provide a degree-granting comprehensive liberal arts education to people who are incarcerated in Illinois. As our nation reckons with the systemic racism of America's criminal justice system and its pernicious investment in policing, criminalization, and incarceration, this roundtable series aims to open space for conversation on these urgent topics and to bridge research, legal work, policy, and community activism in addressing them. Roundtable discussions are held twice per month throughout the summer, and our next one will be in 2 weeks, and it'll be on policing and universities. I'll now turn this over to Alicia to introduce the speakers.
Hi, my name is Alicia. So in the first two roundtables of the Toward Transformative Justice series, we have started digging into Chicago's history with law enforcement and racism. Today, we feel really lucky to have a panel of 4 amazing human beings. And this is the order they will present. Dominique Morgan, Alan Mills, Monica Cosby, and Erica Miners. At NPEP, or NPEP as we call it, we are constantly reevaluating how to center diverse voices, especially since our students with NPEP are incarcerated and can't join us. So we wanted to bring that to the center. And we are proud to start our third event, Gender-Based Violence in Policing. And I'll introduce each of the speakers individually before their individual talks. And so we'll start with Dominique Morgan. Dominique Morgan uses they pronouns, is an award-winning artist, activist, and TEDx speaker. As the executive director of Black and Pink, the largest prison abolitionist organization in the United States, they work daily to dismantle the systems that perpetuate violence on LGBTQ, gender non-conforming people, and individuals living with HIV and AIDS. Partnering their lived experience of incarceration as a youth, which included 18 months in solitary confinement, with a decade of change-making artistry, advocacy, and background in public health, they continue to work in spaces of sex education, radical self-care, and youth development with intentions of dismantling the prison industrial complex and its impacts on our community. If you can help me welcome Dominique. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a lovely opportunity to be speaking with folks in my time zone. Most often because I'm based in Nebraska, folks are like, what time is it there? So the Chicago folks, the Midwest folks, shout out to the Midwest and Central Standard Time. This conversation of looking at the ways that violence lives from the carceral state on bodies that don't identify as male, on bodies that really live in the fringes of our norms in society. Sometimes it can become overwhelming for me to think about what I see through our work here at Black and Pink. We have about 23,000 members who are in our database all over the country. Who are navigating harm in some way, shape, or form. We are seeing the stories of folks who are released that are then in these communities that are being sold the truth that police and these systems of harm are a resource for them, but they're consistently being attacked and hurt through these systems. So it's the gift of abolition to me and values of abolition have been life-changing because as a person who grew up in the system, I was in the adult system from the age of 18 to 27. I'm 38 now. And presenting as female at that time and using she and her pronouns in that time, it's been a blessing for me to divest from those beliefs that those systems are for me. I can't say that I can mitigate all the harm that possibly can come to me, but it makes it easier for me to know what's happening and how these systems really live. What can be the most difficult for us in our work is getting to folks on the inside, getting information to them, supporting them in, although I think PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, is a trash law. It's one of the few systems that we can support folks in learning about and weaponizing to have some sort of relief. The Black and Pink newsletter, we currently print that 7 times a year. And that's a space where we try to put that information. That's where we try to give folks resources. We try to counter any false narratives that are being put out there and let people know that we're watching. One of the things that I witnessed every day in prison, folks who had a family member, a mother, a cousin, an auntie, a random friend that could call the prison when something terrible was happening, somehow the system would know that that person couldn't be messed with. And so through the newsletter and through our other work, it's like we're letting them know we're watching you, that you can't just hurt these folks. These people are valuable to us. So many times this system benefits off the idea and the way that we move around incarceration in our community of that when you're incarcerated, you have no value, you're useless, no one cares. So because we push that belief and we engage with people in such a way, the system believes they can abuse them without consequence. They don't walk around abusing middle-aged white men that way because they know it'll be consequences for that. They abuse and they attack and they oppress, specifically in this space. I'm talking about Black, trans, and gender nonconforming folks, because they believe that none of us care. They believe that they can kill them, they can put them in solitary confinement, they can remove all the things that make them them without consequence. They can do all of these things, and because of who they are, no one will challenge them, and therefore they continue to perpetuate it. I spent 18 months in solitary confinement under PREA. There was no rule violation. There was nothing. And 6 of those months, I actually had to live on the death row gallery here in Nebraska because of how over capacity the solitary confinement unit was, the special management unit. And I remember every 90 days, I would go up in front of the panel to ask them, why am I being locked down here? And no one had an answer, yet they continued to approve my solitary confinement status. And they tried to sell me the lie of the only way that they could protect me was by locking me in a room all day. I use this, I'm a visual person. The Virgos in the room, y'all, this ain't gonna really hit y'all. But for the Pisces like myself and the Cancers, y'all will get this vision, right? If there was a foster parent or an adoptive parent that was bringing young people into their home, and they started bringing in more young people than they could handle, young folks were dying, young folks were being abused, young folks weren't learning, young folks were being sexually harmed, all these other things. How long will we let these homes exist? In what I hope to be the best scenario, we're gonna close it down. These systems have the audacity to steal bodies, mistreat bodies, and then think that they're not culpable for the harm that happens to those bodies while they're in their custody. And from the abolitionist space, right, that's what I think stresses me out the most is, how do you have a restorative experience with a system that refuses to acknowledge the harm that they've done for centuries? And for me, if there's not an opportunity for me to have a restorative interaction with you, then there's no way that I can engage with you. Furthermore, that's amongst a plethora of other reasons why these systems have to be dismantled and they have to go. They'll never own up to the harm that happens. They'll blame it on the neighborhood the young person grew up in. They'll blame it on race. They'll blame it on a simple desire that the person doesn't want to have access and be their greatest self. I don't know anyone that doesn't get out of bed and want to touch their best self. It's just so many people struggle with figuring out the path to that. And when we're looking at gender, when we're looking at race, Black folks, Black trans folks, Black gender nonconforming folks, who do we look to see the idea of what our opportunity and what our greatness can be? And so when we're in these systems and we're trying to grasp for something that can feel like a lifeboat, honestly, there's been nothing that's been put out there for us. So at Black and Pink, it was really important for me. Jason Leiden is our founder, and now y'all call it Chicagoan. Is that the proper tense? Okay, I don't want to upset nobody because I know y'all Chicago folks don't play. Jason Leiden is now there, but Jason founded Black and Pink 15 years ago. And I use terms like legacy work because I really need to respect the shoulders and the work that I stand on. Jason was Black and Pink, and Jason and the work of Black and Pink, you could see it through so much demonstration, through the newsletter, of course, the Pen Pal program, all of these radical transformational pieces of work. My background in public health and navigating needing these services when I got out of prison, right? I came home February of 2009 after a decade of being locked up. My mother died in December, and I had to adopt my youngest sister, right? I had a 12-year-old. So I was figuring out how to be an adult myself and like raising a child, and I needed services. I needed help with my lights. I needed someone to help me get into bigger housing. I needed someone who could help me navigate. I didn't have a license. I had never had a license, all those things. And so in my mind, it's like, let's tear these systems down. But then I ask the question, I know it's devastating in there. But what I also know is that most Black folks, especially Black trans and gender nonconforming folks, the world is devastating for us out here. So not only do I want to get rid of this space of harm, I want to make sure that this world that I want them to be in is ready to love them and give them the access that they deserve. So you saw us create programs that were in this gender, race space, transitions. We have spent over the last 2 years nearly $100,000 housing Black trans folks here in the Midwest through Leiden House, which we actually opened Leiden House on the 11-year anniversary of my release from prison in February of this year. We decided we wanted to create our own space for our family to live. That's not a halfway house, that's not a shelter, it's a home. Yesterday, after one of the longest days ever, a 19-year-old Black young trans woman, I helped her make her first pot roast. And that is what this is for, right? This idea that folks can see and touch their opportunity. With COVID response, we were able to distribute about $30,000. We have another round that we're distributing, and we in our programs department very much focused on these intersections of race and gender and folks who have been system impacted, because we want to recognize the harm that folks who have been system impacted all across the spectrum experience, but we know that the opportunities for them to get access is far greater. We know. I ask everyone right now, y'all all know people who have been incarcerated. Y'all name me 5 Black people that you know who have been incarcerated, who are now sitting in a space where they can thrive. And then if you can give me 5 Black folks in general, tell me 5 Black folks that are either trans, GNC, or identify as cis females that have been system impacted, that you now see them in a position where they have access and the opportunity they deserve. I do this work every day, and I would struggle to tell you about 5 folks who have been able to break through this oppression, this powerful force field that the system puts on them. But I hope that my time as executive director at Black and Pink that I'm able to be a part of building systems and programs that give people that roadmap to liberation. The last thing I'm going to say is that really what we're talking about is liberation. And I think we know that overall the goal should be collective liberation, right? Liberation for all, liberation for none. But I kind of see it like when you spark a fire. If your candle is burning, it's easier to light other candles, right? And if you've ever seen a candlelight vigil, if you will, one candle is beautiful in the night. 5 of them is gorgeous, but thousands of them is something that you'll never forget. And for Black folks, Black trans and GNC folks, trying to light your candle can take sometimes your entire lifetime. And oftentimes your life is stolen from you before you've even had a smolder to your candle, right? So we're trying to do the work. We don't have all the answers. It's some days are definitely harder than others, but I believe that everything I experienced in prison prepared me for this job I have now. And the people that I serve are the reason I get out of bed in the morning. And I believe that this is how I'm able to not disrespect the grace that I've been given and the opportunity I have. But I am an anomaly, and that bothers me every day, that I'm not looking to my left, I'm not looking to my right and seeing my sisters that I was locked up with, the sisters that I've never met that are just my sisters because they're my sisters. And I'm trying to do the work to where I'm just a name on a long list of folks who are sickening, who the system tried to take down, and we beat them. So I thank y'all for having me here today. I thank you for seeing and affirming the work of Black and Pink. I thank you for understanding that this is not easy, and I will challenge you to continue to unpack how that intersectional oppression of mass incarceration is something that we should all be scared of and we should all be aware of. Do not stop at this very surface and no shade, but sometimes very academic way that we try to deliver conversations around the carceral state to folks. I need you in the midst of all the academia, which is so important and so valid. I need you to keep the humanity centered. I need you to focus on the story and the narratives. I need you to continue to challenge not only yourself, but everyone around you, because it's literally life or death for folks like me on a daily basis. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dominic. That was such an invaluable presentation. And thank you so much for the labor that you put every day and to keep us accountable too. Thank you so much. I will now go to our second speaker, Alan Mills. Alan is the Executive Director of Uptown People's Law Center, a nonprofit community legal clinic located on the north side of Chicago. UPLC is a legal organization that fights for justice for tenants, disabled, and prisoners in Illinois. Alan has tried dozens of individual cases on behalf of prisoners in the last 40 years. UPLC is currently lead counsel in 6 class action cases alleging that Illinois prisons violate the constitutional rights of the people who are kept there. These include claims such as medical and mental health treatment, the state's failure to accommodate the communication needs of deaf and hard of hearing prisoners, a claim that hundreds of guards used excessive force during a series of shakedowns, as well as a recently filed case challenging the IDOC's failure to protect prisoners during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I welcome now Alan Mills.
Good afternoon. I want to start by stepping back a little bit and looking at the system as a whole. I can't duplicate what Dominique talks about from personal experience, so I need to step back and be my lawyer self. I think it's important that we understand that the system as a whole is a violent system. It's built on violence. It's a system dedicated to punishment and to isolation. And just to go through some murder statistics compared to the rest of the world, the other so-called advanced countries that we like to compare ourselves to. Germany, murder, 5 to 15 years. Heinous murder, 17 to 18 years. Norway, 6 to 12 years, 21 if it's heinous. Norway, you may remember, is where the Nazi went in and killed 70-some children. They got 21 years in prison. Portugal, 8 to 16 years, 25 years if it's heinous. Sweden, 10 to 18 years. Illinois, 20 years is the minimum for any murder. No good time, 20 years real. Particularly heinous, mandatory life. Our sentences are way off the chart compared to the rest of the so-called Western advanced world, and certainly compared to most of the rest of the world in general. It's also isolating. Our prisons are built far, far away from communities. They are designed to ensure that people will not be connected to their communities. They're designed to ensure that people won't be connected to each other. Any sort of collective relationship in a prison is discouraged and punished. That includes romantic relationships, friendships. If you're too close to another prisoner, you can get transferred somewhere else. And certainly any political or anything that looks political, not in the sense of democratic elections, but in the sense of caring about the world around you and how it works. My favorite example is where 2 prisoners at Pontiac decided that they would study anarchism together. They got labeled as the Pontiac Anarchist Collective, labeled as a prison gang, and sent off to segregation. Each spent an extra year in prison for alleged gang activity, when all they're doing is studying anarchy. Even groups dedicated to self-support. Case last week, woman at Decatur Correctional Center sat down with 3 other prisoners, 6 feet away from each other, wearing masks, appropriately social distance, to talk about how the fact that the prisons have now been on lockdown for over 3 months was affecting them. They were decompensating. They wanted to know what they wanted to talk about, what they could do about the fact that they were all getting much worse off. Guard came along, asked them what they're doing. They told the guard. She got sent to solitary for unauthorized group activity. That's the kind of isolation that our prison system imposes on people. We are unique in large parts of the world for believing that the way to control people, the way to make sure that people follow the rules, is to inflict greater and greater punishments on them. It's not the way the world actually works. If you think about your kids, hopefully they're not behaving because they're afraid of being locked in a cage or beaten. They're behaving because you're all part of a loving family. And everybody understands that if you get along together, everybody's better off. Well, that's true about society in general. What actually makes these communities safe is strong community bonds. But our prison system and the larger prison industrial complex, which includes everything from policing all the way through parole, is designed to destroy those bonds, to pull people away from those communities. The other thing that flows from this extraordinarily punitive and isolating theory of our prisons is that prisons are among the very most binary systems in the entire country. There are men's prisons and there are women's prisons, and never shall the twain meet. But the world doesn't work like that. Not everybody is male or female. Trans people don't fit into our prison system. In the world, it's bad enough, but at least there are lots of spaces where both men and women coexist in the same space. There is no such place in prison. So anybody who's not binary, anybody who doesn't fit the traditional gender roles, doesn't have a place in our prison system. And like everything else, the immediate reaction of the prison system is punishment. You don't fit the stereotype, and therefore there's something wrong with you, so we have to punish you. That means that in general, in every prison across the country, prisoners are assigned to a gender based on genitals, based on the gender they were assigned at birth. Trans women end up being housed with men. Trans men end up being housed with women. If you're gay, you don't fit the typical stereotype of what people should be. I've heard guards say, well, if you're gay and in a men's prison, you can't be raped because, of course, you like having sex with men. And therefore, there's no such thing as a rape in a male prison if you're gay. If you're a sex worker, I've heard people say, well, you can't be raped by a male guard because that was your job. So you're just doing the same thing you're doing before. It's not a rape, it's just a job. And if you're trans, then you're asking for whatever abuse you get because you chose to present as the opposite sex. So of course that must have been to attract men or women or whichever way you end up being misclassified. And that has, all of this has real effects on real people. Brian Stevenson talks all the time about how you have to be proximate to really understand what goes on in justice. And so I need to tell two stories of clients of mine. One is Tiffany, young woman, grew up in Central Illinois, young white woman, ended up homeless, sex work for survival, set up a date with what she thought was an adult. It turned out to be with the adult's nephew, sort of his coming of age present. Mom found out, called the police. Tiffany got arrested, not for sex work, but for rape, because she's an adult. The person she was having sex with is a minor. And of course, consent is not a defense to child rape. Went to solitary when she got into fights. Her mental health problems, which had existed before, got a lot worse in solitary. Eventually, she was put on crisis watch because she tried to kill herself. Crisis watch in prison means you're completely isolated. That isolation only made her worse. So she'd be strapped down for days on end. When they took the straps off, she'd try to harm again. When she stopped harming herself for long enough, they put her back in solitary, and it was a cycle that went on and on until towards the end of her sentence, where she ended up on crisis watch, meaning stripped out in a room with nothing else for 8 solid months. No books, no TV, no radio, nothing, no cellmates, no out-cell activities, just sitting in a cell, stripped naked with a blanket, alone for 8 solid months. Somehow that was supposed to make her better. At the end of that 8 months, her sentence was up, so they had to let her go, but they didn't return her to the community because they knew she was not ready to go home. Instead, they had her involuntarily committed to a hospital, which is where she'd been trying to go for the last 8 months. She said, I need to be in a hospital, not in prison. Sadly, she later committed suicide. She never got over that long stint in solitary. Strawberry, this case has kind of gotten some publicity in the last few years, was a trans woman assigned to many of our men's prisons. She was complaining about sexual harassment at Pinckneyville, a medium security prison. So she ended up being transferred to Menard, our maximum security male prison, way down in Southern Illinois on the Mississippi River, as punishment for making complaints about guards and for resisting when people made sexual advances towards her. At Menard, it got much, much worse. Guards would come along and taunt her. She was continually harassed, groped, assaulted. Eventually, we filed a lawsuit, got her removed. After many years of litigation, she ended up at Logan Correctional Center, where her life finally became more or less normal. For those of you not from Illinois, Logan is our main women's prison. Unfortunately, she too is back in prison. It's hard to recover after you spend all those times, as Dominique pointed out. The supports are not here, and the damage that we do to people makes it almost impossible to come back again. I'm going to let Monica talk about the actual violence that's inherent in women's prisons, because unlike me, she lived through it. But I can assure you that violence in the prison system as a whole is not an aberration. It's a defining characteristic of our system. When you go into this with a belief that the way to control our social problems is to punish the victims of our social problems, then that means anything that happens in a prison, the immediate reaction is punishment. An expert we work with toured some prisons in Norway, where they run a very different system. Small prisons, lots of community involvement, lots of community inside the prison, as well as connections to the outside of the prison. And as they were touring it with some US prison officials, they saw that there was a big tree in the middle of the yard, which is typical in a Norwegian prison. Lots of trees, grass, etc. Something you almost never see in male prisons anyway, in the United States. And the guard said, well, that's a huge security risk. How can you have a tree here? Norwegian prison officials are like, why is a tree a security problem? The US guy thought for a while, well, so if somebody climbs a tree, what are you going to do? How are you going to get them down? Don't you have to like use force and you get a taser out and all? And the Norwegian prisoners guards like, no, we would just wait for them to come down. And that, I submit, is just an entirely different way of how prisons should operate. Because if somebody climbed a tree in Illinois, the prisons would be out there with tasers, they'd be out there with shotguns, they would probably chop down the damn tree in order to get somebody down immediately. Because punishment and compliance are what it's all about, not building community and strong ties between people. That's a system based on violence, and that violence is unfortunately all too often gender-based. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. I am really excited for our third speaker, Monica Cosby, who Alan has worked very closely with. Monica is an organizer, activist, and mother who was incarcerated for 20 years in the state of Illinois. She now works for the Westside Justice Center and is the lead organizer of Moms United Against Violence and Incarceration. And it's just a wonderful and valuable spirit in the Chicago movement community. Monica has also spoken about growing up in Uptown, the lessons about liberation and abolition she learned while inside, and the transition after coming home. Please help me welcome the very special Monica.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Dominique, thank you so much for everything I said. I want to say, it's not. Was my roommate twice. Can y'all hear me? No? What am I? I'll be right back. Headphones. Let's try this again.
If you're having trouble with the video, it could be.
Is this better?
Yeah, I'll let you know if
okay.
it's.
Okay. So, Nancy Cuniff, can you hear me now? I can see you in the chat. Just like thumbs ups. Okay. All right. Hey, everyone. I had a whole bunch of stuff that I was gonna say, and I'm just not now. I knew Tiffany Rusher, who Alan was just talking about. She was my roommate twice, maybe 3 times. And some of this I'm gonna speak to a little bit later on, but when we're talking about the violence of prison period, right, whether we're the violence of designated men's institutions, designated women's institutions, there are moments where, because it's there so much, we don't often think of how violent they actually are, because it's so much of everything about the prison. So I have maintained that I've also maintained domestic violence in the whole government, but in particular, and you can see it like super well in the prison, like when the both of you were talking about isolation, right? And how important it is for the people that run these places to know that there's somebody out here care and all that. I have seen anything to you. They'll get you anyway, even if you got people, but they know that they can't get you as bad, right? Like they'll get you anyway and be like, but we'll deal with it later, you know? But we have to have that. This is isolation. They control who you get to see, who you can talk to on the phone. Like it has to be pre-approved. Who can come you. The we're able to read and the music that we're able to listen to and the programs that we can or cannot participate in, right? You are so under control. Men's underwear. And so it's like actually somebody's job to come check our underwear, right? It's somebody's job to come and check if we're wearing a bra, you know? They will walk through the wings and through the shower room while we're there. And literally, I've literally heard CO say this, I'm trained not to look. You're not gonna walk past like 100 women or 100 people in a dorm and not see them, because you're actually trained to look at and see every fucking thing, right? It is the retaliation. It is the arbitrary rules that get made up on the spot. On top of like a 200-page rule book of stuff you can and cannot do, there's also all the that you can make on the spot. And you can't just direct orders. You can write the grievance later, but then if you write the grievance, you're going to be in seg, right? You are so completely isolated. They retaliate against writing grievances. Having even with people that are concerned about, well, if I make these calls to the prison, aren't they going to retaliate? Probably, but the person that's asking you to make those calls, we know what's going to happen to us. So if we can take it, you don't get to bow out if you say you're an ally, talking about something that's for my own good. Do what we asking you to do. That's support us, right? There's so much I want to say. I almost was crying when you were talking about Tiffany. Tiffany she was so hurt, and she was also one of the most beautiful people that I've ever known, right? When we lived in three of us in the dorm. And this,
sorry,
hello?
Sorry to interrupt, Monica. I'm getting some messages that your audio is cutting off. You may want to turn off video. Just
Turn off my video?
Yeah, that'll help the audio.
Okay. Let's see.
Sorry again for the interruption.
No, that's cool. So can you all hear me better? Awesome. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Also, I'm going to go turn off this fan, and that might help for later on. I really don't have much more. It's just I'm asking society or of our society in the prison, right? I believe in abolition because everything tells me that they've been trying to reform these prisons since they built these motherfuckers. The reform I don't have all the answers to what that looks like, but I know what it isn't, and it ain't prisons and police. And that's what I got.
Thank you so much, Monica. I'm sorry that the audio kept going in and out.
That's okay.
It was such an amazing talk. Thank you. And now our final speaker is Erica Miners. Erica is Professor of Education and Women's and Gender Studies at Northeastern Illinois University. Erica teaches, writes, and organizes in Chicago. She has written about her ongoing labor and learning and anti-militarization campaigns, educational justice struggles, prison abolition and reform movements, and queer and immigrant rights organizing. Erica is the author of several books, including For the Children, Protecting Innocence in a Carceral State, Right to be Hostile, Schools, Prisons, and the Making of Public Enemies, and is the co-author of Flaunt It, Queers Organizing for Public Education and Justice. Welcome, Erica Miners.
Thanks so much, Arturo. I see you out of the corner of my eye, so just wave if my Wi-Fi goes, okay? First, I want to start by thanking the organizers. As one of the many hats I wear, I'm part of the Prison Neighborhood Arts Prison Neighborhood Arts Project, which is honored to work alongside NPEP at Stateville Prison, a maximum security prison for people the state considers men. And I really deeply value our shared commitment to people, to education, and to liberation. So it's a pleasure to be again in dialogue with the good folks at NPEP. And it's also just a joy to be in conversation with valued comrades, Chicago comrades, and Dominique. You're in the same time zone, and Black and Pink is a national org, so I'm counting you in as a Chicago comrade. And I also want to acknowledge the reason for our political movement in this moment, defund the police, abolition placards in every street, is because of decades, centuries, I'd argue, of collective organizing. Black and Pink, Uptown People's Law Center, Monica, both her work inside and immediately after release with organizations like Moms United Against Incarceration and Violence, the many other organizations, Love and Protect, Sylvia Rivera Law Project, Survived and Punished. Remember the hashtag No Cop Academy in Chicago just a couple of months ago? It is individuals, it's not individuals that are going to get us free, it's collectives, it's organizations. And they're going to keep us free. So I just want to lift that up. It's so important. It's the steadfast work of these and countless other community-based organizations and networks, collectives, ad hoc and formal, often initiated and led by women and or women of color specifically and or queer folks that have labored to make abolition irresistible and necessary. So I'm thinking, of course, about my comrade Jackie with the Black Organizing Project in Oakland, who worked for 10 years to remove police from the Oakland School District, and they just won that campaign, right? So the fact that we're in this moment is because of that long trajectory, which I would argue is part of the Black radical tradition, particularly the Black feminist radical tradition. I would just want to insert there, right? So this moment is possible because of this long, powerful history of networks, particularly those organized by women of color and queer folks who know intimately that turning to the state for safety, turning to criminalization does not make them or their communities safer. So that's sex workers, that's undocumented folks, it's queer and trans people, incarcerated folks, young people. All of those communities know intimately that the police, that district attorneys, that social workers are there to protect them, and they've developed tools, communities, practices. Of course, they're not perfect, to reduce harm and to support one another. So abolition has always been about building what we need, what we make, right? And feminism has been at the forefront here. So I was asked a couple of questions in my 10 minutes, and I made some notes because I am following instructions today on this webinar. So just as a little bit of a backup to the 3 questions I was asked, I co-wrote a book called The Feminist and the Sex Offender, Confronting Harm and Ending State Violence. And I wrote that book in part because as an abolitionist, I was always asked, what about the bad people? What about the rapists? What about the child molesters? And in order to respond to this question, both as a feminist and as an abolitionist, I felt like I had to write it out, right? I had to reconcile, this is what I thought initially, I had to reconcile these frameworks. And then what I realized quickly, of course, is the indivisibility of the two. Abolition has always been built through feminist organizing, in particular, women of color and or queer women feminist organizing. And of course, my feminism is not possible without abolition, and my abolition requires feminism, right? So I just want to lay that out before I hit the 3 questions. So my 3 questions are, how does the current criminal legal system respond to sexual harm? That was the first question. So short response, and I think Alan and Dominique and Monica have done violence in our criminal legal system. I'd like to use that term instead of criminal justice system because there's no justice in our criminal legal system. So newsflash, short response, it doesn't, right? The criminal legal system is often one of the worst perpetrators of harm, including gender and sexual violence. I just think, I think mandatory strip searches, right? My comrades in Australia through Sisters Inside have led, campaigns to try to raise the visibility of the strip search, right? As a form of sexual assault, right? So I think just thinking about how it's naturalized and built into the criminal legal system. Of course, our current criminal legal system doesn't transform the conditions that made that violence possible in the first place. So why do some cisgender men, and it's overwhelmingly cisgender men that perpetuate gender and sexual violence, harm women and children, right? Like, so our criminal legal system doesn't help us get at those root causes or change them, right? It doesn't meet the needs of survivors. Overwhelmingly, the majority of people who experience sexual violence and harm, they want that harm to stop. They want to be safe. They want it to never happen again. They want that person to change and be accountable. And they also want to heal, right? And they want to be heard. So the massive resources that are funneled into the systems are deterrents, right? They don't help us address the root causes for gender and sexual violence. For example, much of this book is looking at public sex offender registries and notification systems. We have about 1 million people in the United States that are on public registries, disproportionately African-American men. And there's no evidence that public registries and notification laws reduce child sexual violence, catch perpetrators, or change the culture that makes this harm possible. But there's plenty of evidence that these banishment laws make people more vulnerable, right? And even in this so-called bipartisan moment of criminal legal reforms, policymakers are doubling down on people with convictions for sex offenses. Right now, there's 1,400 people who are still held in the Illinois Department of Corrections after they've served their sentence, after their release date, because there's nowhere for them to go. I mean, I think in this moment of COVID, it's shocking that we haven't gotten more people out, but we haven't gotten people out who've finished their sentences, right? Because of registries and banishment laws. So through one lens, we could say the criminal legal system is a failure. They have failed to address gender and sexual violence. But as an abolitionist, I would flip that and say the system is working exactly as designed. It was never about ending gender and sexual violence. So that was my first question. Second question, I'm rolling along here, was about language. And the question was about harm and violence. And I just want to broaden it a little bit. So yes, language matters. The state, particularly our criminal legal system, works to provide ready-made ways for us to understand our experiences and those of others, our world at hand. Whether it's prisons for children at the border are called, what did I read recently? Immigration holding facilities, right? Or certain people are classified as nonviolent or violent offenders. This language shapes us, right? It doesn't actually help us understand what happened, what are the conditions that made that harm possible or violence possible. So whether it's sex offender or prisoner, terms provide ready-made frames for people and communities. So I think not using the state's language is a key tool for practitioners of restorative and transformative justice. So for example, we're going to use the terms perpetrator, right, of harm or violence, right, and survivor to widen that frame beyond this dualism of victim and offender. So in the book, we use the term harm rather than crime because, of course, crime is a legal category. It's malleable, it's political, it's voluble, it's volatile, sorry, I can't. So not all harm is criminalized and not all crime is harm, right? Harm instead is an experience, it's a relationship. It allows people to name and describe what happened to them. It also gives us room to talk about the ways institutions and the state also harm people rather than just what individuals do to other individuals, right? So the last question I was asked to answer is, what are some alternative responses to sexual harm that scholars and activists are envisioning? Again, I love replying to this question. I just want to start with a little bit backing up, a caution to remind ourselves that our criminal legal system doesn't address sexual and gender violence, right? It doesn't meet the needs of people who've experienced harm, doesn't transform the conditions that made gender and sexual violence imaginable and possible. So as if locking up Harvey Weinstein made work sites free of gender and sexual violence, right? And of course, gender and sexual violence are always inseparable from white supremacy, ableism, that concept of intersectionality. To constantly remind ourselves of that because the state is always promising that this is addressing it, but it doesn't, right? If we don't, and I think the question then becomes, if we don't have police or public registries, for example, what will we do about gender and sexual violence? Well, we aren't doing much meaningful now, right? The state, right? The cycle of arrest, prosecution, sentencing, public registries, for example, isn't a deterrent. And it detracts us from paying attention to the root causes. Also, I want to push back on this term alternative, which we're seeing a lot in this moment. There's lots of comments in circulation now about alternatives. What are the alternatives to policing? And I think the alternative implies that there's just some other room we need to go into, or a checklist, right? And to quote a valued comrade, freedom is a constant struggle, right? And abolition is not a lifestyle we're looking at here, a paradigm shift, right? A national organization, I'm a member of, Critical Resistance. About 10 years ago, we put on a national conference, and we used these 3 frames to understand that the programming of the conference and our thinking. It was dismantle, change, and build, right? In some cases, we know what works and what we need to dismantle and build to create safer homes and to reduce, if not eliminate, gender and sexual violence. So for example, if we had queer affirming, free sexual health education, if we had quality and free childcare, right? So some things aren't rocket science, but policymakers have continually chosen not to invest in these. Instead, we fund public sex offender registries for billions of dollars nationally, while no research illustrates that they deter or eliminate sexual violence, particularly targeting children. So I just wanted to start that question by pushing back on the term alternatives, by reminding us the state isn't doing anything right now, and that, if we're thinking about eliminating gender and sexual violence, we're thinking, I'm pushing us to think about what do we need to dismantle, what do we need to change about ourselves and our communities, and what do we need to build. And so what are people doing to address harm and violence? I want to lift up transformative and restorative projects that are trying to meet the needs of people who've experienced harm. And I'll just shout out a couple here. Creative Interventions and the Storytelling and Organizing Project, which archives everyday people's examples of how they're responding to hard stuff in their neighborhoods, in their families, right? Without resorting to police and banishment. And it's messy, it's ineffective, but it's messy and it's complicated, but I think it's an important example. To, of course, the People's Street Medic Brigades. Like right now, if we call for healthcare in many places, we're also getting policing. So how do we support ourselves when we can't trust that if we call for healthcare, we're gonna get healthcare, we're gonna get police instead. So there's so many examples of transformative and restorative projects, and I know many people on this call have examples, so I just want to encourage people to share organizations and projects. But abolition has always been about building. Feminists have always been making a way out of no way for as long as I can remember. Work sites, where women share with other women who are the creeps to avoid and how to get back at them, right? Thinking about some of those strategies. But coming back to the question in terms of alternatives, right, with that frame around it, I also just want to name the elephant in the room, and finishing this book project was just such a strong reminder about that. The main perpetrators of gender and sexual violence are cisgendered men. If we're committed to reducing, forget for the moment, ending gender and sexual violence, we need more cisgender men working with other cisgender men to unlearn the racialized product of heteropatriarchy, right? Imagine if we funded armies of men to do this with each other. So I'm gonna end there. I think I was slightly under my 10 minutes, but I'm open to conversation. And thanks.
Great, thanks so much to all of our panelists. These were really incredible presentations and a really great way to begin our conversation. So now we're going to move into the Q&A session. So just as a reminder for everybody, feel free to send your questions at any time. Send them directly to Charlotte Rosen in the chat. And I'll be reading them. So here's the first question, which I believe is for all of our panelists. It says, given that we have all this evidence that shows the harm of prison systems, harming folks inside through isolation, making it harder for people to rejoin communities after being released, and not being a deterrent, what keeps the system in place? Is it a lack of knowledge of the general public? Is it money and political lobbying? How should we understand this commitment to the prison industrial complex?
I'm happy to start. I think it could be obviously it could be a whole panel itself, that question, but I'll take a stab at it. So, I mean, you have to look, obviously, these things don't occur in a vacuum. Systems tend to be there because somebody benefits from them, so it's important to figure out who that somebody is. and I posit there's two obvious answers here. One is that the emphasis on prisons and law and order in general has, since the 70s, been a way of distracting the public in general from what Erica just talked about, the underlying causes. It's so much easier to punish poor people than it is to solve the problem of maldistribution of income, of the vast income gaps that we have in this country. It's much easier to lock mentally ill people away than it is to deal with the fact that this country has no public health care system that deals with mental illness. It's much easier to take sex workers and throw them in prison rather than providing with employment opportunities that allow them to earn a decent living. It's much easier to lock up drug dealers rather than trying to figure out why so many people in this country want to use drugs. So it's a way of avoiding the hard conversations that politicians don't want to have as to what's really wrong with this country and why is so much harm being done and why is it being selectively enforced against. The other answer, I think, though, is that it's a huge source of employment for lots of rural areas. People always talk about the private sector of private prisons, but that's a tiny little piece of the pie of where money gets spent. The vast majority, or the vast plurality of money that goes into our criminal system goes to guards and police officers, personnel. Those people depend on the prison industrial complex for a living. They constitute a strong lobby in many small towns. When they try to close a prison, there's an immediate blowback by the entire community saying that this community is going to be hurt, and that's always driven by the union or the employees organization, whatever that may be. So I think those are two simple answers. I'm sure that we can go on a lot longer, and I'm sure other people on the panel have their own ideas.
Do any of the other panelists want to come in, or should I go to the next question?
I can just add a footnote to Alan's point. And Dominique, I teach at a university, and so this is like a string of 25-cent words, but I think white supremacy, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and ableism. I mean, it's not a surprise as somebody who's been in many prisons across the country and across the planet. Like this is sort of the root causes point that Alan is flagging, like who's most likely to be locked up, right? It's certainly not rich people, so I think thinking about those, like this is my kind of push in this political moment. Yes, of course we need to defund police and invest in community practices, but social workers and counselors, are also policing Black caregivers in ways that, and particularly Black women and Black mothers, in ways that are harmful and punitive. So unless we also pay attention to this underlying set of belief systems, white supremacy, capitalism, heteropatriarchy, ableism, right? Then, and work to challenge and dismantle those, we're just gonna have those same beliefs kind of pop up and crop up and be empowered by other forms of the state. So I think it's, the importance to do this sort of both and work at this moment. So it's my little tiny footnote.
That blessed me right there. Because it also made me realize we haven't talked about youth at all and the way that youth navigate these systems. And in that moment, I really was thinking, like, my first experience with someone that felt like they were supposed to be there for me, but they were working a part of a system that was harming me, was as a 12-year-old navigating, having a case manager and being put into therapy that I didn't consent to, and being pushed through these systems. And a lot of the work that I do, like in my personal work, is around juvenile justice. And when you talk to folks who work in the juvenile justice system, they don't want to use terms like youth incarceration. They want to say out of home placement. They want to align themselves in a space where they feel like they are the good guys and they don't want to hold the harm that the juvenile system does. And in my opinion, the harm of the juvenile system is even worse, because as an adult, you have a space where you recognize, my autonomy and my voice is kind of being taken from me, or it's being dampened. now all over in our society, when it comes to young people, we silence them, we remove their power, we want to take away their choice, and that's young folks who haven't been system impacted. One of the silent things that being system impacted says to people is that we don't know how to make good choices, so y'all need to make choices for us. That's what they're trying to perpetuate. And we already think that about young people. So I think it's real, we need to look at that, to that preschool to prison pipeline as well, and how insidious that is. It's 95 folks on here now. Don't be afraid to understand that dismantling and unpacking is also going to mean many of the things that you think protect children, realizing they don't, and us coming up with other options in how we really hold our children and our young people, and help them see that community is available. And I think so many folks are like, oh, the big dark prison with the clouds over it. Yes, let's get rid of that. No, but also we got to get rid of these foster homes. We got to get rid of these youth shelters. We got all these things that go into it. So Erica, thank you for sparking that in me. But we cannot forget about young folks in these spaces of gender and race that are experiencing high levels of erasure in the work.
Thanks so much, everyone. So we have a related question, actually. So I'll move to this one next. This says specifically for Erica, obviously everybody can come in. So the question is, for the social workers on the call, can you talk a little bit more about policing and social work?
Oh, I'm so happy you asked that question. I always get a little nervous when the question is specifically for me, because I think, oh, I don't know if I'm going to know the answer to that. But it's the 20th anniversary, I think, this year of Dorothy Roberts' book, Killing the Black Body, which I think does an amazing job of chronicling the history. I mean, of course, if anybody's a social worker, the first thing we want to do is understand the history of that profession and the history of that field, right? Which has been about regulation and maintaining, again, my 25-cent words strung together, white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy systems, and also a workforce, right? So I think understanding the history of our profession and the history of social work, looking at what organizations like the National Black Association of Social Workers, when they wrote, I think it was their first or second platform statement in 1968, they tasked white social workers to address the #1 mental health problem in the United States, white supremacy, right? So I think that fields, and I'm not a social worker, but fields and professions have, there's always resistant voices, there's always organizing voices, there's always people that are pushing back. So I'm really appreciative that there are social workers on this call, and I know that there's many of you that are working to challenge mandated reporting laws, right? There's many of you that are thinking in critical ways about how to not perform some of the practices that Dorothy Roberts so beautifully raises, in her work, and many other important scholars. There's many of you that will speak out and organize when things like laws are passed that criminalize parents for bed sharing, right? Of course, white affluent parents can share their bed with their child through attachment parenting, but who's most likely to be punished or caught for sharing a bed with a young person is usually a woman who's low income, right, or doesn't have the space, or sharing a bed for space, religious, cultural practices, right? So I think I want to encourage social workers to look at the margins often of their fields, right? And it's unsurprisingly, it's usually people of color, queer folks with disabilities who are doing the organizing in those professions and fields, raising the critical questions, asking, are we policing here, right? Are we doing the time-honored work that our profession has always done about sort of regulating, family regulation system is a term that Dorothy Roberts used recently. So I think particularly in this moment of sort of, fund counselors, not cops, right, in schools, yes, but, right? So I think I would love for to hear more robust discussions from people doing that work who are really thinking critically about what it means to support, walk alongside, and and so divest from sort of the family regulation system and invest in families and communities in parenting and childcare systems. So I'll stop there, but great.
Great. Anybody else want to come in? Or I can move to the Monica. It looks like you want to come in. Sorry.
Yeah, a little bit. Can y'all hear me? Do I need to turn my camera off again?
I think we can hear you. I can hear you right now.
I'm turning it off just in case. Okay. Everything that everybody has already said. Erica, I love you. I love you. I did a training not too long ago for legal aid workers and social workers. And I got pretty much unanimous agreement that the system needs reform, and I still think it should go, right? But I got near unanimous, agreement that the system needs to be formed. And one social worker, they were a social worker, says, but what about the people that are trying to trick the system? And I got like super mad because I'm like super impatient with all of this anyway. But I asked her, I was like, well, what about a system that has to be tricked for somebody to get the resources that they need? And I got a couple of head nods and some questioning looks. And so I was like, so how many of you that are on this in this training right now have ever had to call somebody else at another agency, organization, or whatever, and trade in a favor that maybe they owe you to get to the resources that you needed to get for your client? And that was almost everyone on the call. And so I asked him, do you feel like you tricked the system then? Right? And people were like, well, okay, so that tells you that that has to go, right? The greatest number of children under foster care nationally, whether they call it DCFS or whatever it's called in other places, are Black and Native children, right? We are and there are, like here in Illinois, there are 22 different reasons why the state can terminate your parental rights. Most of those reasons center around what you have. Do you have enough food in your freezer? Do you have a bed for each kid? How big is the place that you live in? Do you have an individual bed? All these other things directly related to material wealth, right? And you're criminalized for being poor and being Black and being just not, right? For just not having. And rather than saying, well, hey, we see you need this help to get a bigger place, to be able to pay for it, to have food in the refrigerator and all these other things. But they criminalize you if you don't get it, but nobody helps you do it, right? Nobody helps you get it. I was asked, and I've been asked this a lot, what do people coming out of prison, particularly primary caretakers, most of whom are usually moms, right? What do we need coming out of prison? And my answer flat out was going to be the same shit we needed before we went to prison. Safe, non-coercive housing, food security, healthcare. And when I say healthcare, I'm talking about the whole healthcare, the physical healthcare, your reproductive healthcare, your mental healthcare, the whole healthcare, right? We needed those things in our lives and so much more. But we needed these things in our life before. We needed healing and the chance to do that. And also, one of the things that prison strips us of is the chance to repair harm, right? I think it strips us of the chance to repair harm. Most of us in the prison have been harmed, as well as, maybe have committed some kind of harm, right? But it removes the chance to commit harm. So when we build community with each other in the prison and we take care of each other, that is completely discounted 9 times out of 10 out here in a lot of spaces, right? And so we are expected to still, I don't know how to say this nicely. I don't really know how to say this at all. So coming back from prison, there's so much expectation, like especially if you've done a long time, you're supposed to know everything already. You're supposed to be fully adjusted, like smack, smack, smack. And it just doesn't always happen like that. I've been out here for 4.5 years actually. And I'm still confused about some stuff and I'm still learning things all the time. It's like not an easy thing to adjust to. And then I'm not necessarily the most traditional type of person either. So I don't fit in a lot of places. And so a lot of the resources that are available to people coming back from prison are incredibly coercive also, right? And so that whole thing, all of that needs to change. That's what I have. Thank you. Erica, thank you for everything. Dominique, oh man, I learn so much every time I get on a call with you. This is awesome. And I'm muting myself now. Shut up.
Great, thanks so much, Monica. And thanks again, everyone. I agree. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody else on the call has learned a lot so far. So I'll go on to our next question now, which says, could any of you talk a little more about how you see the role of community and community building as a response to sexual and gender harm? How can we address the isolation as punishment frame, not only in the prison space, but also within everyday interactions? Monica, you're muted. Did you signal that?
Just if you could say the question again.
Yeah, so the question says, could any of you talk a little more about how you see the role of community and community building as a response to sexual and gender harm? How can we address the isolation as punishment frame, not only in the prison space, but also within everyday interactions?
So oftentimes I try to, this was the hardest space for me to really wrap my abolitionist mind around, because the how indoctrined I had become during my incarceration, right? You have this world where it's like any type of convict is okay except someone who's hurt a child or who's engaged in sexual harm. Like that was bored into me. Outside of that, being a person who experienced sexual harm as a child, and then sexual harm, I was sexually harmed by a correctional officer about the last year of my sentence. And so this was over a decade ago. And I remember going through the process. There was a rape kit, all these things. I remember the state detectives like attacking me in the interviews about, you have to be lying. If you are lying, all the things are gonna happen to you, so on and so forth. Under PREA, they put me in solitary again. I was in there for 30 days waiting for the DNA test to come back. And I ended up being released, finishing, jamming my sentence, completing my sentence. And I was so excited to go to his trial and see the system treat him how they were going to treat, how they treated me. And instantly I knew once I walked in that wasn't the case. I heard them talk about my record. I heard them talk about his family and how important his family was. The judge didn't want me to speak in open court, all these things. And the idea that the system was going to offer me the relief and the restoration I was really hungry for evaporated. At the time, I didn't have a language or understanding of that's just what systems do, especially for Black folks. But it was like, oh, I'm not gonna find I'm not gonna find what I'm looking for here. And I say that to say to y'all, I believe a foundational thing that a community can do, we can say that there is no hierarchy of good or bad when it comes to people. We can say, and we have to stand on, healing does not happen through incarceration and jailing people. And even if you don't have the space to talk about the healing of the person who engaged in the harm, which they deserve to be a part of that process, the person who was impacted. I challenge anyone, social worker, anyone who works in those spaces to show me how the number of years that someone was incarcerated brought relief and restoration to the person who experienced the harm. Community can start speaking truth to what we all know is that what they've given us as the answer is not the answer. Community can be comfortable being afraid because there's fear, right? Even when something is shitty, but we know what it is, it will hold on to that. We're asking people to let go of this shitty thing and envision something new. Community can sit in that fear and can hold it. Community that has not been directly harmed by that violence can step up even further. And community has to be the ones that does the work to really figure out how we restore and engage around the harm that happened. Because we're not saying folks who have been impacted by sexual harm that it's their job to go through these restorative circles and such and such and such. No, that's when community comes in more than ever. So community is essential to the process. So speaking truth to power, dispelling these ridiculous narratives that people will put on Facebook. We've all seen the abolitionist post and then someone's like, well, what about rape? Right? And it's supposed to be that gotcha moment. Community has to really educate themselves and be prepared to have those conversations, not run away from it, not be angry when it's brought to us, even if it's trying to trip us up. We need to really understand the why of our abolitionist movement. And the last thing I'm gonna say, community, especially white community, you all engaging in abolitionist work in this very surface way, or in a way that is kind of like plug and play, you do a disservice to the work long term because you're not prepared to have this conversation. Baby, when Erica sent that book, I just sent that link to all my staff because it's one of the most scary spaces to talk about this work in, because it's so many unknowns, right? If you steal my bottle of water, it's like, okay, we can figure out how to engage in something around that. How do you navigate when it comes to stealing trust, to stealing all those things, and what we're trying to navigate? So community needs to speak truth to power. Community needs to educate themselves, and community needs to understand that for this to work, we're going to have to be essential to the process. We can't just watch it. We can't just watch restoration happen. Community is going to have to actively engage. And that means that community is actually going to have to be community.
I mean, I just want to add a footnote to Dominique's, I think, really beautiful. I really appreciated that you were willing to share that pathway, because I think that's a really familiar pathway for many of us, that there's many kinds of harms that can be repaired or restored, but there's sort of like another category. So I really appreciate that. And I also just want to add, maybe my role in this conversation is to keep adding footnotes, is that when we say that the community has to step up, if you're someone, I mean, there's a lot of people in a community. And if I'm someone that's experienced gender and sexual violence, maybe it's not my work to do this. Maybe my work is somewhere else, right? Maybe my work, and I need other people, right, who feel like they can work with the vast amount, largely cisgender men that are perpetrating sexual and gender violence to do that work, just like it's not every person of color's work to challenge white supremacy, right? So I think that we really need to be thinking, you know, when we say that community is the answer, we need to, like, you know, pull it apart a little bit there and have a tiny footnote saying that, you know, the challenge of this political moment is that there's so much that's, you know, fucked up is what I would say, but I'm on a call with Northwestern, so I should be a little more proper. But there's so much not working, right? But there's so many places to plug in, right? So maybe just borrowing Dominique's problematic plug and play language, like there's so many places to do the work, right? And I think particularly around sexual and gender violence, if you're just at least willing to say, not in my name, like I've experienced gender and sexual violence, but you know what? I'm not going to support criminalization. Like, I want a different kind of victims' rights movement. I want a survivor movement that's actually about restoring resources to my community and my neighborhood. And there's many organizations that are doing this work, including Black and Pink, right? And Mothers United. But I want to just, you know, try to make sure that we're not leaving this conversation with sort of a monolithic idea of community, that the work, we all have to take up this work, because I think we're all very differentially situated here. And I want to allow a place for people who have experienced different forms of harm, right, to not have to be that person doing that work all the time, right? So.
Great, thanks everyone. So I think we have time, depending on responses, for one or two questions. So the next question says, so how do the panelists feel about the current mainstreaming of abolition in response to the racist police murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and too many others? While certainly a major opportunity, do you have any fears about how the movement might get co-opted or undermined by the state or other reactionary forces?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to get in on that last question real quick.
Oh, of course.
Um,
Okay. Didn't see you want to come in.
when I love that we're saying community is the answer, right? And everything else. So during the time that I was in prison, like we build community there too. And so we have, and I'm going to use a specific person. I'm not going to say her name. She's been locked up for like 40 years. A little over, I think. And so she and I have never really become like super fast friends, but we're cool. And this is what I know of her. And I got locked up in 95, right? I got out in 2015. I stayed in Cook County for like 3 years before I got to the joint. So I got to the joint in 1998. For the entirety of time that I knew this woman, she has worked with women on MHU in a way that their paid psychiatric staff could not do. She worked with the women that they kept in the isolated MHU seg cells, right? And pretty much everyone that she was able to work with was able to come out of those cells and function either in MHU or back in GP. This same woman has like she's tutored countless people coming through IDOC to get their GEDs, go on to whatever academic or vocational classes, and get out and be able to stay out, right? I don't understand why that wouldn't be considered restorative at all, but there are people, like I was saying earlier, we don't count the ways that we build community and care for each other. But that same thing can be replicated out here. So if we have somebody that's like in the middle of whatever they're going through, sometimes you just need a place to be for a week or so and some quiet and somebody just to sit with you, you know? And depending on whatever staff is working at a given time in the joint, rather than sending somebody to SEG every so often, they'll be like, "And you girl acting crazy down the hall, just go get her for a minute," right? And so if we can figure this shit out in fucking prison, I know it can be, and it is being figured out in a lot of places, you know what I'm saying? But there are just ways that, and I don't mean like alternatives to calling the police. I mean, taking care of our shit ourselves without even the existence of police to call, right? And in dealing with, so a lot of, because there is some interpersonal violence that happens in the prison between us, right? And so in our relationships that we have with each other, our romantic sexual relationships that we have with each other in the prison, which by the way are illegal, and if you get caught up, like you're going to SEG forever and ever, and they're going to take time from you and all of that stuff, because they police who we can have sex with consensually in the prison, right? But if we have sex with a CO, we go to SEG, and they only committed custodial sexual misconduct, not rape. That's a whole other conversation. Well, it is part of this, but whatever. And so when we see these kind of violent issues interpersonally with a couple that may be on the unit, we take it up for a couple of reasons, right? Obvious reason, and it seems callous, but an obvious reason is that you bring in heat to the unit, right? You bring in heat to our spot. Like, we don't need the police. We already in the prison. We don't need the police right here in our faces. And also, what are you doing? Like, so we just kind of, we're like, look, you can't be putting your hands on people, you know, cut it out. And might be a little more forceful than maybe something you'll see out here, but we take that up ourselves, right? And that can be, and it is being approximated out here, and we can continue to do that. We can continue to do that. And it's just important. I want people to understand that many of us have figured out some stuff or are trying to figure stuff out. And for all the people that are like new to abolition now and seeing defund and disarm and I'm all about the defund, disarm, disband, right? But seeing defunding and like beginning to ask questions about abolition, I think it's beautiful. I do. I think it's beautiful. Like my grandbaby was like, police, and she's 4. You know, so I'm in I'm in rural Michigan right now with my kid and my grandkids, and they're down at the creek, and it's 102 degrees. Oh man! But if she was right here, she's wearing my Freedom All shirt, right? And we're having conversations in rural Michigan. I'm in Reed City specifically. We're having conversations in Reed City, Michigan about defunding the police in the middle of a sheriff's campaign in Michigan, right? I think it's beautiful, and I have so much hope. I also have a whole lot more questions, like, what do people think it is? But the idea right? That people are like, this shit really is just ain't been working. And people, because you have people that know it and just are now like, I've been knew this shit, but benefited from the system that are like, fuck this, right? And then you have newer people that are like, oh man, I didn't even know, but what can I do, right? And I think it's beautiful. I think it's beautiful. And I can't wait to hear what everybody else has to say.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. So I think we are exactly out of time, and I know some people have to jump out.
Can I just quickly say quickly?
Oh, sorry. Yes, I can't see everyone. So go ahead, Dominique. Take us.
In this space where things get mainstream, and so Black and Pink sits in this awkward space, right, of like 12 years as this radical kind of grassroots org, and then folks before me made it a 501c3, and I'm just the one that has to carry it out. I want, and so I think of the funding space for the work. Make sure that no matter how mainstream this is, the folks who have been doing the work are being funded to do the work in a larger capacity. Because you've had folks like Monica, you've had folks like Monica James, you have folks all over the country who have done incredible transformative work with pennies. So what I hope happens out of this mainstreamness of this is that you don't have HRC that starts an abolition division. No shade, no shade. But you know what, you know it's coming. Or these organizations, white folks should not be leading nonprofits or agencies that's doing abolition work. You should not be leading it. So do not fund it that way. If there's a funder on this call, we're all funders. If you gave $1, if you give $100,000, you're funding a mission. And make sure that as this becomes more and more and more mainstream, you are funding the mission, the vision, the power, and leadership of those who are most impacted. Because if you are not, we may well keep what we have and continue to cause the harm and continue to have on our blinders. Please be aware that as y'all see this work happen, that the voices and the hands and the spirits and the lives that have been out here giving themselves to make it happen, the erasure doesn't take place. Because we know when mainstreamness happens, that's when the erasure comes in.
Thanks, Dominique. And I think, Alan, you wanted to come in, is that right?
Yeah, I just want to say, we've been here before. I mean, we had similar inflection points in the past, late 60s, early 70s, there was uprisings all over. There was a real debate about whether or not abolition should happen then. The prison systems were too big back in 1968. Attica happened, and there were sort of two paths we could have taken at the point of Attica, which was the uprising in a prison in New York. One is prisons are horrible, and look what people are rebelling against. We need to do something about it. And the other was, they're animals. We have to lock them down, and punishment is the answer. And those were real competing narratives at the time, just like they are now. And we have the exact same thing right now. Obviously, the abolition narrative lost in the late 60s, early 70s. And we now have a prison system 7 times as big as it was back then. Forget abolishing it. We grew it tremendously. So we have to be aware of that narrative is out there, and we have to be ready for it this time. And that's why calls like this are so important, where we can all share what the real truth is about prisons and talk to people. The fact that it's happening in rural Michigan is amazing. Those are not conversations that I would have expected to happen, and they're happening all over. But we have to continue to put out our narrative, because believe me, there's an organized resistance on the other side to continue to rely on punishment. That's all I have to say on that one.
Thanks, Alan. And Erica, any closing remarks? I want to give everybody a chance to comment as we conclude.
Sure, I just put in the chat room, like, it's crisis and opportunity. I mean, it's so great, but somebody used the term on a call I was on the other day. You know, I've been working with critical resistance for, I think, 15, 16 years now. A crabolitionist, like, you know, if you're the person who's like, there's like, what do you mean by that? So it's like, yes, people are using it. Yes, that's an opportunity for generativity, discussion, debate, which is so important, like this kind of public space, so central. It's hard to think about Zoom as public, but I am right now. So yes, yes, opportunity, but also I think we need to hold the rigor, right? Like we need to hold, like abolition just doesn't mean anything to everybody, right? As Alan mentioned, and Dominique sort of foreshadowed, it can, you know, I think HRC probably already has like a poster about how they have a long history of being abolitionist, right? And maybe they have, maybe you're, hopefully nobody we know is the poster child of that. So I think really leaning on histories of, in particular, Black radical tradition organizing, networks, collectives, and looking to their leadership, looking to acknowledge that trajectory, looking to funnel resources there is so central in this moment. I think, you know, on my good day, on my not so good days, I think we might lose, as Alan alluded to in this moment, but I think if we think for the long haul, what do we win? Even if we lose this moment, can we win shifts in public consciousness? Can we win the formation of new collectives? Can we win some new language? Can we move the starting line for the next campaign, the next struggle, the next battle? And I think we're already there. So I just want to and also by thanking folks for making this conversation possible. It's so great to have a prison education program making these conversations possible, so essential. So thank you for that. And also to my comrades that are the panelists. I so appreciate all the work you do. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, everybody. These are great concluding comments. I'm going to shift now to our director, Jennifer Leckie, to conclude the roundtable.
I just want to take a minute to thank our speakers, Dominique, Alan, Monica, and Erica, for an incredible conversation, and to thank all of the graduate students who worked so hard to make this possible. Arturo, Jonas, Charlotte, Alicia, Zoramar. These are incredible Northwestern graduate students who do an incredible amount of volunteer labor for the Northwestern Prison Education Program and for our community to make these conversations possible. Our next conversation will be in 2 weeks, and we'll send around an announcement. So I invite all of you to join us for that one. Thank you.